Let's go to Genesis chapter 6, beginning at verse 22. It says, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Every generation has the opportunity to live and walk with God or to neglect God. Every single generation has to deal with the same sort of pressures, the same sort of obstacles. I don't know if you've paid attention or not, but there are a lot of different ages in this room. But regardless of which age demographic you fill, we all drive the same streets. We all have the same mayor. We all have the same president. Every one of us woke up to the same weather this morning. We have far more that is the same about us than is actually different. Noah walked before God in his generation. We all have pressure in this generation to walk with him. There's always some kind of temptation that is trying to pull us away from following and serving God. All of us. But Noah withstood the temptation. He withstood the pressure of his generation, and he walked with God. If we came in earlier in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 10, it says Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation, that Noah walked with God. And he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we see in the text that his kids were mentioned, his family was mentioned, and then God says, I want you and all your household to come into the ark. There is something significant about the life that we live that brings impact to people around us. The people who are around you at work, they are impacted by your life. The people who are with you in your neighborhood, they are impacted by your life. The people who are in your household are especially impacted by your life. And so we see here where clearly family was a big deal to Noah because it was a big deal to God. And God said, Noah, I've seen you. And so now you and all your household will step into the ark and you will be saved. Now for Noah to walk with God, how did he know how to do that? At just a practical level, they weren't writing back then. So it's not like he had a Bible that told him what it was that he was supposed to do, that he could wake up like you and I do, and we can just consume the gospel word for word, page for page on a daily basis. How was it that Noah even knew how to walk with God? It said that he did all that God commanded. How did he know how to do it? Because there was demonstrated to him in his home how to walk with God. And it was demonstrated to his dad by his grandfather how to walk with God. And it was demonstrated to his grandfather by his great-grandfather how to walk with God. See, we can take this line all the way back to Adam and Eve. And there was a moment that they fell from grace, and so they had to leave the presence of God. But God said, you know what? I'm not going to leave you or forsake you. I'm going to actually do something for you so you can continue to come and be in my presence. They had actually put on fig leaves to cover themselves from the presence of God. And he says, that's actually not going to work. If you're going to come before me, let me clothe you with what is necessary for you to have so that you can be in my presence. And so in order for God to get the skins of an animal to cover them, what had to happen? He had to sacrifice. He had to shed the blood of an animal in order to give the skins to Adam and Eve. So in this moment, God demonstrates the principle of sacrifice to Adam and Eve. God had a requirement of sacrifice. We see it in Leviticus, we see it later in Hebrews, that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so for them to be covered even temporarily, there had to be sacrifice to be in the presence of God. So they demonstrated that to their children. Now, Adam and Eve had a bunch of children. They had a bunch of boys, they had a bunch of girls. If you're one of these, you're kind of into like population mapping and the math of it all and the way the population would double, like every few decades, there would just be double the amount of people. And so we learn about these two sons of Adam and Eve that get the most press, even though they had a bunch of others. And it said that there was Cain and there was Abel. And Cain offered God a sacrifice that God did not ask for. Abel offered a sacrifice that God did ask for. Abel offered the sacrifice that his parents offered, that God demonstrated to his parents. I just want to encourage you to know that the words that God has placed in the gospel for you are for life. They are for you to live by them. They are for you to demonstrate. They are you to receive them. Jesus said, my words are spirit and they are life. And so there was a demonstration of the words of God from Adam and Eve to their two children. Now, Cain was a farmer and Abel was a rancher. Well, if God asked for a sacrifice that included the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sins, it was easier for Abel to obey God. Why? Because he was a rancher. It was harder for Cain to obey God because he was a farmer. He would have to take from his field and barter with someone else that was a rancher in order to have something that he could offer to God that was what God asked for. I guess I just want to use this reality as an encouragement for you that you may have been raised in a household that you didn't have the words of God declared to you. You didn't have the demonstration of walking with God before you. And as you have grown into adulthood, there are some things hanging on that you grew up with that are not actually helpful in your achieving success, or they're not actually helpful in you serving God. And I just want to tell you that it is still possible and actually commanded that you figure out how to obey God regardless of where you came from. Regardless of what you think might be holding you back, you have to figure out a way to move past that so that you can obey God. Abel obeyed God. He gave God what God asked for. Therefore, God said that which Abel did was by faith. There is nothing that you can do that is faith if it's not what God asked you to do. Like there are times, I've made this mistake before in my life. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But just in case you have, let's all kind of commiserate together. I have seen people do something that God asked them to do by the Spirit. So I'm not talking about something that is in the gospel that's commanded to all of us, right? Like God still speaks. And so God gives personal directions in alignment with his word to all of us. But sometimes I can look at the success that somebody had and realize that the success, because they're telling me, it came from their obedience to God, and specifically they did this. It's not found in the gospel. It's in alignment with the gospel, but it's very personal to them. Well, I have found, well, then I'll go do that. And I might do that, and it doesn't carry the same success, and it frustrates me. But here's the thing. It can only be by faith if it's what God has spoken to you. His word has been given to all of us. Therefore, when any of us do anything in the word, we are doing it by faith. But if somebody received a word by the Spirit, that which they do is by the Spirit, it's by faith. But if you weren't given that word, you just saw them, so you thought, well, I want what they have, so I'll try it. You'll get frustrated because that word wasn't given to you. See, God didn't tell me that I'd be the father of many nations. I'm trying, I have 4 kids. But he told that to Abraham. I can't take Abraham's word and that be for me. How does his word affect me? I'm one of the nations. I'm one of the ones who is called because he obeyed. There are things that God calls people to do that they do by faith, and there is a blessing that you will actually experience when you find yourself with them, but he didn't ask you to do that. So you just enjoy their blessing when you're with them, but you go hear your own word for your life, because God will speak to you. Okay, so we see this moment where Cain and Abel were doing where Cain was not doing what God told him to do, where Abel was doing. And it said that what Abel did was by faith, but what Cain did was not by faith. So then Cain gets frustrated. He sees God accept Abel's sacrifice, but he's not accepting his. So then God goes to Cain and he says, hey, I see that your countenance has fallen. In other words, you have a bad attitude. You've been around people that, man, when they walk in the room, you know that stay away from him today. Don't cross her today. Today's not the day, right? Their countenance has fallen. So God, seeing that Cain's countenance had fallen, he goes to him and says, why are you this way? You're upset because your brother's sacrifice was accepted. Do you not realize you could do well also? But if you don't resist this temptation, sin is crouching at the door and it's going to overwhelm you. Like God warned him. Let me just say this as a pro tip for parents. There's something about being present. There's something just about you showing up and being with your kids so that you actually know what's going on in their lives. We live in a world where everybody's always talking about delegating. Anything you don't want to do, anything that's uncomfortable, anything that's inconvenient, just delegate that. So I guess that means I get to do all the things that I want to do, but I have to pass all the crap off to someone else. Right? Like there's things about parenting that it's not enjoyable. I'm the only one that feels this way. There are those things that we just have to do. Like, you just be present. You just be with them and do the work of being with them. Because let me just say it like this. Every generation of parent, every generation, has been told by the culture around them, by the science or the sociology around them, that this is how you do it. And we do that according to the professionals. And then 20 years later, a new group of professionals come in and they say, no, this is the way to do it. And if you do it like that, you'll ruin your kids. And so now you're here and your kids are 16, 17, 18, and you're thinking, wait a minute. Everything they're telling them not to do, I did that. I ruined my kids, now what? But here's what's fascinating. Just hang around long enough. And then there's a whole new group of parents over here and a whole new group of professionals right here, and they'll tell them, now don't do what they did or you'll ruin your kids. What is consistent? Being with your kids. There's the consistency. There was a moment where God would always come down and he would walk with Adam and Eve. Why? To demonstrate to them how to be with him. He would come down and he walked with Cain and he said, hey, this isn't gonna work. Like what you're doing isn't working. Parents, let me just say, there are things that only you can say to your kids. They're not gonna hear from anyone else. You need to be the one to say to them, hey, you gotta straighten this out. Let me just ask you this. Do you know anybody, you know how we can always see the faults in others so well? Like so easy. You ever had anybody, a friend that is coming up and they're sort of complaining to you about how life is going? And you can look at them and you're like, of course it's going poorly, this and this and that, like just straighten these things out, but you won't actually say it. We don't actually say it. We're like, oh, I know, man, I know. Well, God's with you. You just hadn't caught him by surprise. What are we talking about? What are we even saying? Why don't we ever just pause and say, well, yeah, because you're being stupid, and if you keep being stupid, it's going to keep going like this. But nobody will. Okay, parents, you get to be that person. From the time they're old enough to understand, forever, you get to be the one that says, hey, that's not working best. That's not going to lead to life. But let me just say this, as they get older, Their capacity or willingness to hear you here will flow from you having spent time with them here, where you sacrificed to be with them. So they actually know that you have their best interests at heart. I come from a long line of overworkers. My dad worked long hours all the time. My mom worked all the time in the house, never stopping, never. Like, I can remember coming home and being like, where is she? Because I wanted to avoid that room because she was always doing something. And if you walk past mom and she was doing something, guess what you got to do? You got to help. People sneak out of their house through the windows. I sneaked in my house through the windows. So I grew up around that, and you just worked all the time. And so I was working all the time. And my dad said to me when Walt was really young, we hadn't had Kate yet, and just, Ab and I always had stuff going. I was working a lot of hours at work, but we always had a side hustle, and we're just getting it all the time. And he came to me and he said, let me just say this. If I could say anything to you, if I could have it all to do over, I would have spent more time with you boys. Now, there's a guy who walked with God, who demonstrated a relationship with God, and he said, if I could just do one thing over, I would have spent more time with y'all. He didn't say I would have disciplined you less. He didn't say I would have put you in a different school here, a different school there. He didn't say any of that. One thing, I'd spend more time with you. So as a brand new dad with half an ear to hear, what do you think I decided I needed to figure out? How to spend more time with my kids. And this principle exists throughout Scripture. We see God with Adam and Eve. We see God with Cain. We see Jesus with his 12 disciples spending time with them and them spending time with him, walking with him. So we have this person named Noah who understood how to walk with God because generations had walked with him. Because here's what happened. We see Cain come into this moment and he doesn't heed the word of the Lord. He goes and he kills his brother, and then God shows up and he says, okay, because you've done this, you can't be around these people. You have to go out from there. Again, back he had to go to the land of Nod. For you skeptics, let me just say, because of population mapping and the amount of time that these people lived and the way they procreated, it was very, very, very possible for there to be hundreds of people on the earth without God like creating some people over here and then God creating some people over here. No, Genesis 3 tells us that Eve was the mother of all living. So God wasn't creating people all over the place. Just for the skeptic, I know the most of you people grew up in the church, you don't actually have doubts there, but some people do. Eve, the mother of all living. Every word of God proves true. This is why we always stick with what the word says, because the word is where we get our doctrine for life from. Okay, so there's this land over here where there are other people, and he's afraid to go over there because he says, they might kill me. Who might kill me? All the people that Eve had given birth to, who were walking away from walking with God. And they were dispersed around, and they're in a place called Nod. And so then Cain goes out from his household, and he goes to the land of Nod, and he starts having children. And he has a son named Enoch, who then has a son named Lamech. And they name a city after Enoch. And then in that city, Lamech, the grandson of Cain, living according to the lifestyle of Cain, he kills a man. And in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23, he says to his wife, I have killed a man who wounded me, a young man who struck me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. What he's saying is, if my grandfather avenged 7 times, I will avenge 7 times 70. Now, hopefully that triggers a number that you remember from a conversation that Jesus had with his disciples. When Peter said, how many times am I supposed to forgive? 7 times? And what did Jesus say? 7 times 70. There is a Jesus way, there is a gospel way, there is a kingdom of God way, and there's a kingdom of the world way. And so what we see happening in the city of Enoch, in the land of Nod, is that they are walking according to the way of the enemy, not according to the way of God. They're living according to the way of Cain that they learned in the household that was the opposite of the way of God that Abel was living in his household and that Adam and Eve were living in their household. And then at the same time, now back in the nice land, outside of the land of Nod, now we're back over here at the east of Eden. It says to Adam and Eve was given another son, verse 26, chapter 4 of Genesis. And it says, to him, to Adam was given Seth, and then Seth was given a son whose name was Enosh, and at that time they began to call upon the name of the Lord. So from Adam to Seth to Enosh, they are calling upon the name of the Lord. From Adam to Cain to Enoch to Lamech, what are they doing? They're avenging not 7 times, but 77 times. And so there is a way that leads to death, and there is a way that leads to life. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and right out here, it was me and Paul. He's on the 4th row, so I'll just point him out right here, Paul. And so, Paul, you're single, right? I do this to all my single friends. You don't have to stand, but if you want to just show yourself, like, he's looking. So if you're a single female and you want to come hang out with Paul, he'll be in the lobby today. Great human being. Okay, so it's like almost a pastoral endorsement. I don't know how any of his dates have ever gone, so I don't fully endorse him, but I partially endorse him. All right, so he and I are having a conversation, and we're having this like fun little talk, and it's about, the generations and all this stuff. And I said, it's funny. Like, I wonder, he's younger than me, he's only 30. I said, I wonder what we're going to say, like when we are at the age, or I said, you're at the age where someone who is 60 today, I wonder what we'll say about like all the theories that a 30-year-old had today. I wonder if they're gonna work so that when you're 60, I'll be over here looking back and saying, man, that worked great. I'm like, what'll work? See, if I was sitting here and I looked at the way of Cain and I looked at the way of Abel and of Seth and of Enosh, I would say, I want to do that. But what happens is when we're in the middle of a generation, we can tend to just look at it our way and think, oh, this is going to work, but will it work? If it's not founded on the gospel, if the principle is not confirmed in the word, then it won't work. And there is a principle that is consistent in the gospel from Genesis to Revelation. And that is this, that if you walk with God, it leads to life. If you do not walk with God, it leads to death. Jesus Christ did not come to redeem us from obeying God. Jesus Christ came and redeemed us so that we could walk with God. And so I don't look at someone who's walking with God and say, I want to have their success and their life, but I want to do it this way. I might think that, but I know where this goes, so I'm going to do this. See, there's a reason that Christianity throughout the book of Acts is called the way. We see it in Acts 9, we see it in Acts 19, we see it in Acts 23, we see it in Acts 24. Consistently, Christianity is called the way. Why? Because there's a way to do things, a way to walk with God, and a way to walk away from God. Walk away from God, experience destruction. Walk with God, experience life. This is what we constantly see. This is what was going on in the life of Noah. God said, I have seen you, and you did this. You did all that I commanded you to do. And then we see this further in Genesis 6, verse 5. Actually, if we went a little earlier. And God says, I have seen the wickedness of man, and it is great on the earth. For every thought of the intention of their heart is evil only continually. So I will blot out man whom I formed from the earth. Verse 8, but Noah found favor with God. So the ones who on the earth were living according to the way of Lamech, according to the way of Enoch, according to the way of Cain, they were going to be wiped out. But those who lived according to the way that Seth lived, according to the way that Enosh lived, according to the way that Noah was living, that household, they were going to be what? Saved. And when we see this, it puts a little bit of pressure on us, right? In our households to live in such a way that our kids will see this is the way that leads to heaven. This is the way that leads to God. They have named the name of Jesus and they walk with him. They have named the name of Jesus as Lord and they follow him. But those who do not follow him will be lost. Like he uses the word here, I will blot them out from the earth. Now, when we see that language, it just sort of awakens our curiosity. We can double click on it, and it takes us to all the places where he talks about blotting out. The majority of the places where the gospel talks about blotting out is actually in reference to the book of life. We don't talk about the book of life much. It's sort of mentioned in different spots. We see it here in Exodus. We see it again in the Psalms. We see it again in Daniel. We see Jesus mention it. We see Paul mention it to the Philippians. And then we see it throughout the book of Revelation multiple times. This book of life. Like, what is the book of life? We look at the book of life and understand it really through three different theological streams. And the reason why those matter is because the thing you believe is how you will live, and it's how you will raise your family. It is how you will live in front of people. So it's not just theology, it's doctrine that we live by. And so we take this one source, the book of life, and it flows into three different ideas. So let's just kind of walk through the ideas and see which one attaches most to Noah. We'll do top line, what I call the top line, or the one that I would affirm or say that this is correct. This is what I think is correct according to the scriptures in the gospel. We have this top line idea that there is the book of life, that God, because it says in the book of Revelation that the names were written that are in the book were written at the foundation of the world. The foundation of the world is that moment when we had sinned and God said, okay, I'm going to save humanity. And so I'm going to send my son through the woman and he will crush the head of Satan. That is the foundation of the world that was prophesied, where there was going to be an end. So now there is a beginning and there is going to be an end to this. And so there's a book of life where God wrote in that moment, he prophesied you, your life, your existence. He prophesied everybody's life and their existence in this moment that would carry out through the generations. And so the names are written down. So now I get to here, let's just take where we are right now in modern times. 8 billion people on the earth. 8 billion. About 2 billion of them say that they love Jesus and say that they serve Jesus. So 2 billion people, as it stands today, forget about what happens in the next 5, 10, like 8 billion people on the earth, 2 billion say I love Jesus. Where are those 2 billion people going? It's not a trick question. To heaven. Where are the 8 billion people going? To hell. That is a sobering reality. Who's in the book? Like, we can see this as God wrote everyone in that would live. And for everyone that would live that was born, because they're written in the book that they would exist, for every one of them, Jesus died for them so that they could be born again. In the absence of what he did, they could not be born again. But because he died for all 8 billion have the opportunity to be born again. They're written in the book because they were to be born and were born. But who are those who are left, who remain in the book? It's the ones who are not blotted out. Why would they be blotted out? Because they rejected the grace that God gave to them. So if I die in this moment, away from him, my name is blotted from the book of life. My name does not remain, and I will not spend eternity with him. That's one way to see it. Another way to see it, which my Calvinist friends would say, is that back here when he wrote the names, that 2 billion people he wrote in because he was going to save them and that Jesus was going to die for those 2 billion, but he would not write in the other 6 billion that he would give life to because he wasn't going to die for them. That I'll write the 2 billion and I'll die for them. The 6 billion I will give life, I will create, I will form them in their mother's womb, but I will not give them the opportunity to be born again because they're not elect. So they have no shot. Those 6 billion have no chance. You can preach to them, but it's not going to change anything because their name wasn't written in the book of life because God never intended them to go to heaven and he didn't die for them either. That's the doctrine of limited atonement, which I believe is wrong. So we have this idea and we have this idea. And then we have the idea in the middle that's a little unique in that it borrows from both. And it says, no, everybody can be saved. But once you say yes to Jesus, now you're on the track like these guys are, and there's nothing that you could ever do that would ever cause you to walk away from that which God gives you. That would be an eternal security doctrine. The idea of all three of these will affect the way that you teach your kids. It'll affect the way that you live. It'll affect the way that you do funerals. My dad has said this before. I love this statement. He says, everybody wants a carnal wedding, but they want a Christian funeral. The wisdom of the ages. I love it. So if I'm raising my kids and their life doesn't matter, then I'm living like my life doesn't matter. Because if I just bring them to church, to VBS, and they say yes to Jesus, then that's the end of it. I'm not actually going to be concerned with teaching them how to walk with God because that's inconsequential. They're already going to go no matter what they do, no matter what they walk away from, as long as they name the name of the Lord once, they're in. It's a complicated doctrine, especially in light of things like Peter. Let me throw this out there. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4 in reference to the days of Noah. The days of Noah, the book of life, it teaches us a lot. He says, if God did not spare the angels who sinned and he cast them into hell. So that's like way back here when Satan fell tempting Adam and Eve and he took a third of the angels of heaven with him because they agreed with him. It says if God didn't spare them, and he did not spare the ancient world, but he preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly and to keep the unrighteous under punishment. And then he goes on and he talks about this group in the middle that I was just talking about here. Verse 19, he says, for if they leave the entrapments of the world, the defilements of the world, if they leave them and are again entangled in them and overcome by them, the last state for them is worse than the beginning. For it would have been better for them to have never known the way of righteousness than to have known it and turned away from it, from the godly command delivered to them. Why would it be worse? Like, is hell going to be hotter for the guy that says yes to Jesus and then says no? No. It's that if you say yes to Jesus and you are rescued from evil and you can be in his presence and you can have his Holy Spirit within you and you can gather with his people and you can live this way and you can just wake up with the peace of God and the joy from heaven and fellowship with him. If you can experience this and walk away from it because you think this is better, you're probably never going back. But the guy that never tasted it, at least he's thinking maybe. So he says it's better for that person. all I want to pull out of that is this. You can say yes to the way, and then you can walk away. You can say yes, and you can leave. And to the one who leaves, what does he say? He says, God preserved Noah, but what happened to everybody else? The floods came and destroyed them. But what was true for Noah and his family? Now let's turn up the volume and amplify the good part here. What was true for Noah and his family? That they stepped into the ark and were saved. Because of what Noah did, there was salvation for people. Like, let me just say, dads, moms, when you live this life in your household, there is the opportunity for blessing upon your children that is just beyond compare. That when they see how you walk, when they hear how you talk, when they see your demonstration, when they know you and know how you have lived and what life you experienced, let me just say, that speaks volumes. That is a testimony to them. Let me just throw this out. I'm not always practical. One of the reasons I'm not as practical bringing my own examples into the house is because, I don't want you to just think you have to do it because I do it, okay? But let me just kind of share how we kind of worked through some things when our kids were young. One of the things that was big when, say, Walt was young was travel baseball. When I was a kid, I played baseball, and it was just city league, man. You just got out there, and you wore jeans, and you had a T-shirt with a number ironed on, and you played baseball. And somehow kids made it from there all the way to the major leagues. I don't know how in the world they did it. Just a little knock on travel baseball. It's fine. Now, in my kids' era, it was travel baseball, and it's just really sweet uniforms and multiple uniforms and trying out for these big teams, all these stuff. And it was no longer like on Tuesday night or Thursday night or Saturday morning. Now tournaments are Saturday all day, Sunday all day. And so to do this, to be a part of this, it's really hard to keep your kids in church. And so there would be 10 of these tournaments a year, and I would tell the coach, I'm like, hey, give me 2 tournaments that he has to play in no matter what. But the other 8, he may not play in. Meaning, he may not play Sunday games that happen in the middle of church. And that was those were major conflict moments between coaches and a dad. And there were major conflict moments between a son and a dad. But we just said church is more important than anything. And we're going to do this. And so even though you're only 13, you're gonna be living by my standards. Those weren't his choices. They were my choices that I imposed upon him. And here's how this would play out. There were times he'd have a game on Sunday and he'd have to be there at 8 a.m. and we would drop him off and he would play while we were getting everything ready for church. And then his grandfather would pick him up after that game, bring him to church. He'd be there in his uniform with clay all over the place, and he'd be on the front row with mom and dad. And then when church was over and we had worshiped Jesus and we'd given glory to his name and we'd received from the word and we gathered with the saints and had fellowship with the saints, then we would go back to the ballpark, and if there was a game to be played, he would play it. If he missed a game, because it happened during church hours, I can remember times where his teammates were coming off the field having lost, and now he's walking up, and he had a pretty good bat, so they liked having him on the team. And they had lost the game, and they blamed everything on him because he wasn't there. You don't think that's sacrifice? Of course it's sacrifice. But there's great reward when you seek first the kingdom. Because here's what God did. In God's word, he didn't ask me to spend the Lord's Day just out in nature enjoying myself and saying, oh God, I see you in the mountains and I see you in the clouds. Is God in the mountains? Yes. Is God in the clouds? Yes. But what did he ask for on the Lord's Day? Oh, he asked that I would be gathered together with the saints. So I can give him the offering of Cain, which was from his field, which was good, but it wasn't what God asked for. Or I can give the offering of Abel, which is what God asked for. And so on Sunday mornings as a family, we just demonstrated that walking with God means you give God what he asks for, and God will bless you. Another thing we did the other day, everybody was receiving their giving letters. You know, at the end of the year, everybody gets your giving letter. I hope you already got your giving letter. They were sent out 2 weeks ago. If you didn't get yours, you better call Kevin, because that means that something's wrong, like you should have already had it. But we all got our giving letters. At least everybody well, that's all 6 of us. We all, either grandparents give you money. If they give you $10, you better put $1. That's God's dollar. Those 9 are yours. Those 9 will be blessed, but you better give God that $1. Like, we demonstrate this. They live in the blessing of God at home. So what we do when the letters come, we open the letters up and we read, this is how much we gave. Everybody's reading, everybody's talking about what they gave. We're celebrating. Why? Because if we live in the blessing, I want them to celebrate the sacrifice. I want them to understand this is what we did in obedience to God. And look what God did. Look what the Lord has done. I want you to live in the blessing, but I want you to understand the sacrifice as well. See, Noah did everything that the Lord commanded him to do. It mattered that boat was 450 feet long. It mattered that it was 75 feet tall. It mattered that it was 75 feet wide. It mattered that it was 45 feet tall. Like, all of that mattered. The dimensions mattered. Why? Because God had a blessing for the earth that he put up in that boat. God has a work for you to do that will bring blessing to you and your household. It mattered that there was only one door and that everybody walked in it, and then God showed up and he shut the door. What was the door that he shut? The one that Noah built. Why? Because God told Noah to do something, and Noah did everything that the Lord asked him to do. And then what happened? He was blessed. And this is exactly what Jesus said. This was the metaphor that Jesus was using in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24. He said, everyone, not just these people that I put in a book because I didn't want to save everybody else. Everyone who hears and does, now I took out this group. Everyone takes out this group. Who hears and does takes out this group. These words of mine, this group, will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rains fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house. But it did not fall because it was founded on the rock. There is something about obedience that brings a blessing into your life. There is something about obedience that God uses to demonstrate his goodness to you. I don't celebrate what I do, but I recognize the obedience of what I do. Let's go back and finish with this. Noah found grace. Let me ask you this. Do not answer out loud. Was grace given to him, just given to him, or did he find it? He found it, but he only found what God gave. I don't celebrate finding. I celebrate him giving. I worship him because his grace is more than enough. I worship him because of what he promised me. I worship him because of what he did. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might be the righteousness of God. We have been given righteousness because of what Jesus did, not because of what we did. But the righteousness that God has given us, that is only because of what Jesus did, empowers us to be obedient and do the things that he has commanded us and called us to do. So I celebrate that I'm able to do what he's called me to do only because of what he did. I give him glory, I give him honor, I give him worship because of what he did. And then I obey him because he's been so good to me, I can't say no. I obey him because his goodness is overwhelming and I can't walk another way. I obey him because I've seen the goodness of God in the land of the living. I obey him because his word is more than enough, and I know if I do it, then I'll walk in the fullness of every promise that he has given to me. If I do it, I will find the grace that only he can.